Module 7. Hi, Joe Cerrone. Today we're going to take a look at Module 7, which goes through and talks about dimensioning styles and dimensioning standards. And we're going to take a look at creating this exercise right here for our mechanical general design, and then this will be our architectural assignment. If we take a look at the textbook on dimensioning and dimension standards, our learning objectives are basically to describe these different dimensioning standards and then to be able to set up drawings at scale and to be able to print them out and to be able to manage different dimensioning styles. Dimensioning is not as easy as you would think. You would think you could just go through and just click on the objects and put the dimensions on there. And for the most part, if they're a mechanical object at full scale, it's pretty straightforward. As we go through and look at things, it gets more confusing when the objects are bigger and they need to be scaled. And so we'll talk about that as we go through this chapter. But in the beginning, we basically look at just dimensioning terminology. Horizontal would be a horizontal dimension versus a vertical dimension, which would be something like this. And they just call them linear dimensions now because you can pick two of the points, and then depending on where you pick the third, it'll either be horizontal or it'll be vertical in its orientation. And then they go through these different types of standards as far as whether they're unidirectional, meaning they're all facing the same with their text, horizontal reading, or like this. This would be this text is not unidirectional because some of them are horizontal and some of them are considered vertical. Location dimensions, essentially when you work with mechanical parts, you'll be locating things like features like holes and cutouts. With radial, kind of similar things. And just basic overall dimensioning and dimensioning techniques. And then as we look at working with dimensions and scaling them, that's kind of the trick to it. And so if we take a look at our exercise from Module 7 at this general design exercise, we'd be looking at this 7A lab, and I've already opened it right here, and it basically goes through and teaches you how to create these dimensions step by step. It walks you through all of the ways to use the O-snap and to use dim angular. I'm just going to demonstrate the techniques for that. And so we can start off by downloading this file and opening it and then adding a linear dimension of 4 inches here. And so to do that, we'll come over here and we'll click on the dimensioning link. And then you can get a copy of the file right here. So you click on that and then you can open it. So here's our CAD file, and it's opened on just a basic mechanical, and I thought it was on a mechanical title block, but apparently it's not. And so if we look at this and we wanted to add dimensions to it, what we would do is we'd go to the Annotate tab, and typically I'll put dimensions onto a dimensioning layer. And so if we come back here and we create a layer for that, line type would be continuous, line weight 0.3 millimeters, and then we'll make it current, and then we can close this. And so to put a linear dimension on, we can go from this endpoint here to this endpoint here, and then place that dimension. And we could place other linear dimensions that exist, but for example, if we try to put a dimension between these points with a linear dimension, it doesn't give us the dimension values that we're looking for. What we really want to do with these is to do an aligned dimension. And so as we start to work with these different dimensioning techniques, we'll take a look at those. And so if we wanted to do these two dimensions, we would use aligned dimensions. And so I'd go to aligned, and then I'd select the endpoints. And it's important that these are aligned to the same points. And so if we take a look at this one with this 3-inch, we're actually going to have this line to be the same length, or it's going to be skewed. And I'll show you what I mean. And so even with an aligned, it just doesn't quite work. And so what we want to do is to offset this through that point. And so we'll say offset through. And now that it's offset through that point, when we use the aligned dimension, we'll get our proper values for that. Other values like radial dimensions would be chosen like this. Radius, and we can choose this point right here and drop that. Notice that it will double dimension center mark them, and so to get around that, if we click on it and go to properties, you can disable the center mark, because I prefer the center marks be put on the center mark layer. So we'll disable it by saying none, and then that'll disappear. Other radial dimensions that we can put in here, or diameter dimensions. And so if we come over here and we say diameter, and we want to go with this, you'll notice you'll get the diameter symbol. And so you want to kind of create sort of a starburst effect. And so as you're dimensioning it, you create these different dimensions and then you work your way around it. Holes should be made with diameter dimensions. Things like arc can be done with radial dimensions. You can adjust them by clicking on them with grips and moving them out. Sometimes it gets a little bit wonky as far as the placement of them. As far as angular dimensions, we go and select the two lines that make up the angular dimension and then place that. Scaling dimensions manually, as we look at it, when we start to work with architectural drawings, that's kind of where it gets into play, because what happens is that this bathroom is actually 10 feet 9 inches, but when we have the default text height at 1/8 of an inch high, it appears microscopic because it's 1/8 of an inch in reference to this 10 foot. And so I kind of use this example from an old SpongeBob that I liked, where you have to set the dim scale to be able to make that work. And so there was an episode where SpongeBob finds Mermaid Man's belt. So the idea is that we adjust the scale settings like we adjust Mermaid Man's belt. And on mechanical prints, there's not a lot to it. If we go to the Annotate tab and you click on these little arrows here, this is our Dimension Style Manager. And if you go to modify it, it's typically right here on the Fit tab that we would set this overall scale. On a mechanical one, we leave them alone at 1. But when we go and we work with an architectural print, so for example, like our door, when we go through and by default we put in a dimension. And so if I come in here and I put in a linear dimension, this one is set because I'm using the architectural title block here. And by looking at the dimension style, we can see that I have my architectural scale set to 24, because what that'll do is it will, like Mermaid Man's belt, increase the size of that by 24 times. And essentially we'll use numbers like 12, 24, 48, 96, like we set the scale for 1/8 of an inch equals a foot, 1/4 of an inch equals a foot. And so if we were to do this at 1/4 of an inch equals a foot, we could set this at 48 and close that. And then when we go to print this out, this would be at the proper scale. I'm going to go and tweak this back down to 24. And then we can go through and add the other dimensions for that by selecting our linear dimensions. Always use endpoints. As far as other things that we look at in the drafting settings, we can go through and take a look at things like arrowheads. And so the architectural ones have architectural ticks. If I wanted to change it to dots, I can change it to dot. I can change it back to architectural ticks. So essentially, we have to set up a scale. Now, we don't use the annotation scaling in the first class. Annotation scaling will automatically set that up. But I do want to talk a little bit about a difference between being able to dimension them in model space versus paper space. And so, for example, we can set up our dimension style in model space by going into our dimension style manager and manually, that's what they call it, manually, setting on the tab this scale. The other thing we can do is we can scale dimensions to layout, and this makes it very easy. And so if I change it to scale dimensions to layout and I hit OK and I close it, that means we're going to be working in layouts, and you can see that it kind of undid what I did there. And so if I go here and I double click in the viewport and then I set my viewport scaling, and so we'll set this at, let's try 1/2 inch equals a foot. And that's pretty close. We could probably go 3/4 or maybe even 1 inch equals a foot. Yeah, 1 inch equals a foot. Looks good. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete out those two dimensions. And once you set the scale in there, what you do is you lock it. And since we've checked off in our dimension style, scale dimensions to layout, when we put the dimension in layout space, it'll come out at the correct scale. So what I'll do is I'll create a linear dimension, and I'll go from endpoint to endpoint, and then I'll do the same thing. This is automatic, and so what this will do is it will automatically create these dimensions, and then it'll put them in at the proper scale. And so by using dimension scaling in a viewport, it works exceptionally well because it automatically sets the proper size of it. The trick is remembering to set the dimension scale in the viewport and then to lock it. So as we look at dimension style, a lot of times what will happen is your styles will be set up by your manager or your CAD manager, and your CAD manager will set those up, and those will be then set in your title blocks. And so your CAD manager will go through and set the line settings. And there's not a ton of things to do here with this. When they talk about all the little things like extend beyond, the extension lines, they're just talking about these little things here, how much farther they go beyond the extension lines. And so there's a lot of little rules like in baseline dimensioning, how to set up and create dimensions according to these techniques. But we take care of most of those for you by setting up the dimension styles and the text styles within your title blocks. Here's another example of all the different arrowhead styles, dimension sizes and breaks. And what's nice about working with AutoCAD is it really does everything. You can dimension architectural drawings, you can dimension mechanical drawings, plats of survey, etc. More on linear dimensions. Zero suppression. These are just small things that you can set up in the dimension style. And so as we look at it, if we go into our dimension styles and we modify them, primary units is an important one. So primary units will talk about whether we're working with feet and inches, which would be architectural, or decimal. If I set this to decimal and then I OK it and close it, we'll now see that it's changed from feet and inches to decimal units, and we'll set that back. Angular dimension settings, again, just a little bit more being able to get into some of the nuts and bolts of it. This is good. Alternate units will allow you to do both metric and imperial units. And so sometimes when I work with a dimension like this, if I wanted to go in and enable alternate units, we can do that right here. 25.4 would be the factor. Here's our zero suppression, where if we had a dimension less than 1 inch, it would put a 0 point something, and we can turn that off. And so once we've enabled dual dimensioning, then we get the millimeter and inch units. And then you can change the dimension styles, and so you can have multiple dimension styles on a drawing, and then you can change those dimension styles as you start to work through it. Here's Joe's architectural dimension style, and then I can choose these other dimensions and styles. Perhaps I wanted one that would be in decimal units, and so if I click on this and then I change that to one of these other units, and it doesn't seem to show up what I want it to. There we go. There it is. So we can change and manage these different dimension styles, and dimension styles are really one of the reasons that AutoCAD is used for so many different design type work, whether it's architectural or mechanical. And that completes this video review.